This EASE webinar is sponsored by Scholastica, a leading scholarly journal publishing technology solutions provider. Scholastica offers modern, easy-to-integrate software and services for peer review management, single-source article production, including PDF, HTML, and XML file creation, and open access journal hosting. Featuring integrations with leading industry service providers, including Crossref's DOI registration and similarity check plagiarism detection services, the Directory of Open Access Journals, Portico, PubMed Central, Altmetric, ROAR, and Copyright Clearance Center's RightsLink Open Access Management System. Scholastica's mission is to empower scholarly organizations to publish top-quality, standards-aligned journals more efficiently and sustainably than traditional options, so they can focus on furthering their missions. We believe peer review and publishing should be as efficient and enjoyable as possible. That's why we design our solutions with all users in mind. Our software features an easy migration process, intuitive interface, and unlimited access to customer support for editors, authors, and reviewers. Founded in 2012, Scholastica is trusted by over 1,100 journals. We serve a robust and varied community, working with publishers across disciplines, from scholarly societies to university presses to library and campus-based journal programs. All of Scholastica's products and services are modular, meaning they can be used individually or seamlessly integrated to help journals bridge gaps between peer review, production, and publishing. We encourage you to visit our website, scholasticahq.com, to learn more about our software solutions and read testimonials from our customers. If you want to learn more about how Scholastica can help you further your journal goals, you can also schedule a demo with a member of our team. We appreciate the opportunity to share Scholastica with you. Now, enjoy the webinar.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to this month's EASE webinar, where we're going to hear from Professor Gemma Derrick on the shocks to research culture and practice that COVID-19 has already inflicted, and we'll also hopefully learn something of what's still to come. Gemma Derrick is an Associate Professor for Research Policy and Culture at the University of Bristol, and also Visiting Professor at OSIRIS, which is the Oslo Institute for Research on the Impact of Science at the University of Oslo. Her research concentrates on aspects of research behaviour under audit, with a particular concentration on peer review and research culture.
Hi, everybody. It's great to be here. Let me just get over the technical requirements for here. But thanks for coming here. I'm a bit nervous with this presentation, actually, because it's a bit of an unwelcome message, because after the shocks of COVID in the lockdowns in 2020 to 2022 globally, perhaps this is not the most welcome message, in the fact that the effects of COVID are not over, and they actually are going to reverberate over research practice, and especially how we translate and disseminate that research practice through scholarly publications into the future. And I really want to talk about two words specifically to keep in mind. They are recovery and resilience. And I want to talk about resilience specifically because we shouldn't be patting ourselves on the back about how well we survived COVID, because the true test of resilience is how we are embracing and altering our own practice as we go forward. And this is a better indicator of resilience as a verb rather than resilience as a noun. And I was thinking about this because I was talking to Fiona before. We always talk about how resilient small children are in terms of the lockdowns that they experience, with restrictions to school, as well as interactions with family members, etc. And I thought it really interesting because we think about children, people who are much younger than us, having a huge amount of resilience, but us as adults are somehow less resilient and need to be. And I want to think about resilience as something that we build, not something that we inherently have. And it's definitely not something we necessarily lose, but it requires maintenance. And in order to maintain that, or create and develop that resilience that's necessary for going forward, this is what a period of recovery is about. It's about reflection, as well as changing things that didn't work, so that next time it happens, and unfortunately it will happen again, we're better prepared, and so that the shock is less. So the first thing we need to talk about is COVID as an exogenous shock. And I use the word exogenous shock because we didn't expect it, and it definitely came from without research, outside research practices. Watermare talks about pandemia, how the process of COVID made us reevaluate how we do things, as well as to reevaluate, reformulate how we conduct science going into the future. And he's specifically talking about higher education's very quick turnaround to provide online learning in the face of the COVID lockdowns and what that meant for practice. But exogenous shocks in science and the science process is not limited to pandemics. We've just had one and it's continuing, but crisis science is something that talks about what happens in a period of crisis. And usually these are much shorter than we had experienced during COVID. And it's literally, there's a lot of research about how research practice and how organizations responded during periods of crisis around the world. And these have been on the Fukushima disaster, the floods of New Orleans and the hurricanes of New Orleans as well. So what I think I want to talk about is that it looks at recovery as a process of learning in the longer term, and it talks about recovery as a process of building resilience to the future. Again, in this situation, resilience is referred to as something we develop. It's a verb. It's something that changes, building. It's not something that we inherently have. So I don't want us to stop and research culture to pat themselves on the back and say how well we weathered COVID-19 2020 to 2022, because unfortunately the effects of COVID are not over. It's something that we're going to be looking at and repairing over a process of nearly up to 10 years. This is really interesting. So we know that COVID-19 had specifically very acute influences on how research was practiced and disseminated. We saw COVID-19 embed existing biases within evaluation processes, within assessments of research excellence. We saw a huge gender gap in the way that people were able to communicate or conduct research as normal. And I'm saying as normal in specific commas because, normal is something that we will contest in this project. But also the fact that we saw parents specifically unable to, 100% engage in their research activities because they were busy trying to fulfill their teaching obligations, but their teaching obligations for the university students, but also for their own children as well. And this extended over a very broad idea about what caregiving is. So anybody who needed care, we were there. We didn't have the resources that we not only had. There have been studies that suggest and actually have shown that the effect of COVID is not restricted to the 2020-2022 period. And the worst thing that we can do now is to forget that COVID-19 is something that we are going to be learning from and mitigating the discrepancies that were further embedded and grew during the COVID-19 process. And also to this is this idea of normal. What is normal? During the pandemic, I remember always talking about, I want to get back to normal, as normal was the ideal state. And yet normal was not the ideal state. We really loosely define normal as something that happened prior to the pandemic. For research, that was not a particularly nice place. Research had all of the problems, and the pandemic didn't create these problems. They just highlighted them by, exacerbating more than we ever saw. At the beginning of the pandemic, I wrote a couple of pieces which talked about, hey, now is the opportunity to embed kindness in our practice, because at the beginning of the pandemic, when this was all, very new and exciting, and we all had this sense of crisis, I was overwhelmed by the sense of kindness that was exacerbated by, otherwise very difficult structural norms that were embedded by research governance organizations. We're talking extension for grant applications, no cost extensions on existing grant applications. We're talking about colleagues trying to offer their services to get things done. All of this was amazing. And I wrote about this and I went, wow, why can't this be something that we do in the long term? And we got a huge amount of response for that. Yes, we should do this in the long run. It's really great. But these two quotes that I'm doing, which is based on a research project that I'm doing with the Centre for Global Higher Education, basically said that normal, even though we admitted that normal wasn't a nice place to be, it was actually admitted to be the ideal place to return to. And we longed to return to normal, to the point that perhaps we forgot how bad normal could be. And as a result, we lost the impotence to actually construct a new normal that was based on our learning throughout the pandemic. And this is what the period of recovery is. Period of recovery is about not forgetting, and also making sure that by not forgetting, we build something that is stronger and more resilient towards the future. Research publishing is no different. A paper that was published in 2021, although it was there earlier, as a preprint by Lutz Boardman, said that the annual growth of publishing articles was what he called unsustainable, because we were looking at a growth of 5% between the last 50 years, and that was only going to be seen to increase. What this means, obviously, is for publishing is, yeah, we've got unsustainable growth, but that's great because it creates this sense of competition within researchers. We have to get ourselves published in order to get review, get promoted, even given money to do research again, and then we enter into this vicious cycle again. We operate academics on a prestige economy that also provides reviewers to offer their expertise as a sense of goodwill. And this is not necessarily to argue that this has been overlooked or this has been taken for granted by the publishing industry. That is a different question. But what we're actually saying here is that in a normal times, the publishing industry relied on these two things: the growth of academic publishing, the hyper competition that it created between researchers, that their prestige in academia was dependent on publishing and also dependent on participating through peer reviewers. Post-normal, however, we see something quite different. We see an influx of submissions, especially since 2021, as researchers who were perhaps locked down and restricted from publishing at what we call a normal level during the lockdown periods of 20 to 2022 are finally getting those publications in, that are finally, submitting those publications. But at the same time, you don't have the same availability of reviewers. Lots of editors, myself included, have said sometimes I have to send up to 40 invitations to get one good review. And that is unheard of in the normal stage. The reason being is that for myself, who was significantly restricted, and this is a very, very, very common experience, when I'm publishing now, I still have a sense that I'm catching up. And so I'm prioritizing my time on publishing what I haven't done prior to it. And therefore, I don't have enough time to give the goodwill that I specifically would have normally had in order to review. So I will say no to reviews, but I will continually put my publication in to be reviewed. This means that we've got longer turnaround times. We've all got the normalization of preprints, which complicates the research productivity argument. And in fact, the whole culture of preprints is a fantastic idea, but it's yet to translate back into academic practice, whereas uploading preprint is considered again, here's that word, normal thing for researchers to do. And of course, with the reduction of the availability of the reviewers, there are bigger questions and louder questions about how sustainable this is going to be. The thing that I'm pointing to is normal doesn't exist. Normal's not real. Normal was a construction we had during a time of crisis where we thought, hey, if we continue to go back to normal, everything will be okay. And as you can see from this quote, there was an assumption by research governance organizations and representatives. And when I talk about research governance organizations and representatives, I'm talking about publishers, I'm talking about funding agencies, I'm talking about policymakers, where there was this assumption that higher education and therefore research that was conducted during these higher education institutions would snap back into shape. That don't worry about it. It doesn't need special care because it will go back to normal, so that COVID will be just a bad memory. And yet we contest this. Normal is not a great place to return to. Normal, we have already argued and we've already shown that it was not actually the best that research could be. And so the danger of assuming that everything snaps back to shape and putting COVID-19 into the past, as well as assuming that the damage that was done by COVID-19 to research practice, dissemination, evaluation, and implementation was restricted to those 2 years, is that COVID will be seen as an excuse for underachievement or for not meeting targets, rather than being seen as a reason to or an impetus for future change. What that does is that if we ignore it going forward, what we end up doing is reinstating and re-embedding an already very fragile, unsustainable research system. This is not in anyone's best interest. It's not as our best interest as researchers. It's not for publishers' best interests, and it's definitely not for the general public, whose taxpayer funding, more or less and predominantly, goes into funding the research system as well. So to give you an idea, we had a research project going on and extended during COVID, like many other people, that was looking at a variety of different research cultures around the world. We specifically chose research cultures that were under audit. So there was this sense of urgency, and there was some changes that could be done in order to accommodate these kinds of discrepancies that we experienced during COVID right around the world. The stuff that I am going to be talking to you today is a whole heap of interviews from research governance officials or stakeholders in research. And as I said previously, this is publishers, policymakers, funding agencies, great big thinkers, all of these things. The reason why they're so important is that they're seen as the change agent in research culture, that research culture change will only happen if two sides of the story come together with an idea or a vision of how things should change into the future. So we definitely wanted to look at the stakeholders to see whether science as a system was resilient to change or whether it was open to change. Fortunately for us, the timing of this project meant that we were actually specifically able to ask questions about COVID recovery and their plans for COVID recovery. And these interviews existed between 2021 and 2022. They're still going on in 2023 too. So we were able to have a very unique period of time in which to see this as a process and how these organizations were targeting or re-evaluating their own practices and their own role within research culture towards, sustaining change. And what we saw is that when we asked researchers to do stages of horizon scanning, we separated their views into three different categories. There was disruption, which was pandemic did bad things to research practice and an acknowledgement of these kinds of disruptions. There was the response, which was their immediate, knee-jerk, although I say short-term there, response caused by the COVID-19 disruptions. And then there was the sense of recovery and the long-term, how organizations were planning to change in the future to make sure to capitalize on the experience that we have in COVID-19 towards building something that is more resilient in the future. And when we talk about disruption, it was predominantly through EDI. We know that this was quite a big setback on the EDI agenda. We also know that by highlighting the intrinsic discrepancies and inequalities within the research system, that we ourselves were not doing research any good. And there was two quotes thing here. The first one from England, which said, yes, it was the worst thing for the EDI agenda and it widened the gap. So we acknowledged it. But at the same time, there was a tendency to say, hey, it was bad, but we're going to have to watch how it plays out in future time. So there was a reluctance to implement something during this project of disruption or implement anything that would, rectify the existing EDI challenges in order to do it. So on one hand, it had an EDI effect, but on the other hand, it's like we're going to hold off doing anything, even though we know that gap is widening as we speak. In terms of response, if we look at crisis science, it was exactly the same. All of these different stakeholder companies were doing exactly what crisis science said, which is focused on making research work easier. So in that, we're talking about the non-cost extensions or the extensions on deadlines or things like that. But at the other thing, we were going to start promoting and pushing research towards translation, offering opportunities, offering answers that could be seemingly implemented very quickly, and therefore going past peer review and research governance's normal way of quality control in order to accelerate it towards implementation. So you see this quote from Norway, for example, that said that even though they had a relatively lower COVID impact compared to other nations in the world, the first thing the Norwegian funding agency said is that, right, we're going to dedicate funding specifically to COVID issues. And this is exactly out of the playbook, exactly what we did. But the one that really upset us is this idea of recovery. And again, I separate recovery into what they said they were going to do in the short, medium term, but also what they wanted to do in the future. They had this idea of thinking about what their role was in order to make sustainable change to research culture. And even in the immediate effect, they were like, right, we're going to do this real-time evaluation of what the effect is. It was against this idea of normal. So they were like, okay, so we're going to look at how it was prior to the pandemic and see what happens after the pandemic. And what we think there is the discrepancy that we need to address, without an understanding that these kinds of effects of the pandemic, there's an ongoing process that happens beyond those 2 years of restrictions. So another thing is that they understood it was a problem for the sector, but for well or right reasons in the immediate short term, an Australian stakeholder told me, I haven't got a time to think about this. I'm kind of managing a pandemic. In the medium term, they thought, okay, this is great. But again, it was dependent on evaluation of the effects of COVID based on what was normal. And normal doesn't exist. So they were like, well, we're going to see what the long-term consequences are of the pandemic before we can act, which is again, meaning that the problem is only going to get bigger. And by taking a snapshot of time, the danger there is that we end up not addressing the problem, because the problem, by the time things are implemented, it's much bigger than we had previously. And the third one is, again, a little bit difficult, which was this wishful heuristic thinking about what is the new normal. And the new normal was a term that came in a lot of the time. But in here, when we asked the stakeholders, they were like, no, new normal, the sector has the way of working, it's how it's going to work, and it's not up to us to change anything. So there was this perception of otherness. They did not necessarily see their role in a research culture to instigate change. To them, it was necessarily had to be something that came from the bottom up, not something that could come from both directions, bottom up and top down, and meet into the middle. And again, from our perspective, when we analyze this highlighted the fragility of research governance tools as they were done in the normal times, and that perhaps as a sector, we are committed to going back to normal and therefore repeating the own mistakes. What this means is that we're not embedding resilience in the research culture at all. In fact, what we're doing is we're setting ourselves up for failure again. One of the biggest research governance tools that we have to make sure we have quality control, that people get good feedback, that they produce the best type of science that they can, is the peer review system. And yet this changed phenomenally during the pandemic, where peer review was something that was taking far too long, that was not fit for purpose during a period of crisis, and was actually embedding biases that existed normally. It wasn't fit for this point of view. And what happened during the pandemic is that for a number of people who were desirous of answers to implement into policy quickly, these aspects were implemented prior to going under a period of peer review. We saw that in the number of preprints that were published in the wake of the 2020 pandemic initially, that had not actually ongoing public peer review and were not actually given an article number until quite later. And just goes to demonstrate what peer review is. And what the funny thing is that when we talk about futuristic thinking, one thing that these governance organizations and representatives did say is that we need to re-question what peer review is. It's been challenged during the pandemic. We've highlighted its importance, but we still don't grasp where it's going to lie. And why don't we need it in the future? And I thought that was really interesting, because this was something that came back to in our interviewees again and again and again. So what this has happened for long-term resilience? Well, without this sense of reflection, and with moving too quickly towards the new normal without acknowledging this new normal based on an assessment of what was normal prior to the pandemic, and blindly going forward without a period of reflection and a period of learning that is essential for an effective recovery process, but also to build resilience in the future. What if this happens again? And here I'm saying, well, it is the task of not just the researchers, but also the research governance organizations to change how we work. How that is, I'm not sure. I don't have the options. But what I am dismayed to see is that the conversation is dying out. I understand people want to move back to normal and move back to a normal world where they can enjoy it, enjoy how things were prior to 2020. But these two things aren't mutually exclusive. In fact, we can move towards normal, but we need to reflect on what happened in the past to build back resilience. The research system is so important in times of crisis. It would be a shame if we missed this opportunity to make it stronger and better as well. So thank you so much. If there are any questions, I'm happy to take them in a chat, which I think Mary is monitoring. And Fiona, again, thank you so much for letting me do this. Thank you.
Well, thank you ever so much, Gemma. That was really fascinating. I guess now's the point at which if people do have any immediate and burning questions, then feel free to unmute yourself and ask in real time, in real voice, or put it into the chat. But if you're just collecting your thoughts, which I guess people might be, I guess I thought it was fun. It's fun in that you put out that I suppose quite a bombshell for the EASE constituency community about the question marks around peer review, and I would be really fascinated to hear what anybody who's actually that's their role, either to manage a peer review of a journal, or be a journal editor, or work in a publishing house, watching peer review, if that resonates with what their experience has been recently. But I guess in the meantime, I'd be really fascinated to hear you say that, Gemma, that you're noticing that this conversation is dying away now. I mean, do you think that, I suppose, the act of doing your research, I mean, do you think that has affected the conversation as well? I was thinking, would it have made the people you interviewed perhaps be more reflective of what was going on, or maybe they would have thought, well, I've given my opinion and I can walk away because somebody else is handling it?
I hope so. I hope also, we all hope our research is going to have an impact and make the world a better place, according to our dream. Although, yes, I hope so. A lot of people had plans and a lot of people didn't have plans. But yeah, I'm hoping that the act of prompting actually made them think about it. But I think that the act of prompting made them reflect on a sense of fragility within the system. What is my role here? What are the roles of the things that I do blindly? Peer review being the first one. Peer review, in my opinion, and I think it's growing as well, is not a sense of quality control. It's not just a sense of rejection or acceptance. It's something that can be utilized for larger purposes and even feed into the EDI agenda. And we're having that thought, we're having that chance now, we're having that discussion now, which I think is great, because peer review is adopted because it's the least worst option. Basically, it's the best of a bad deal, but it does have an essential role. And I think that I've published previously on peer review having a role in providing feedback to people who would not necessarily have feedback opportunities elsewhere. And then embedding that into how peer review is done in scholarly journals is vitally important. So it's not just about accept, reject, minor, major changes, but it's something about engaging in a conversation with peers that are, blinded or not, about how you can make your research better. So it's not necessarily, you only really give up on the peer review process as a reviewer when there's no other changes to be made, not when it becomes acceptable. So I think we need to engage into these conversations. We're not. Peer review, especially for funding agencies, is too quickly said, oh, it's a problem. It's a big problem, and they don't see the powers the power that peer review has to instigate change. They so quickly do away with it and adopt things like lotteries rather than actually have a in-depth conversation about what peer review means and how it can be used to instigate change and help people behave better. Unfortunately, and I speak with a heavy heart here, but very much of a realization that researchers don't necessarily behave in the best way at all times. And peer review can be a very interesting tool to enable that as well.
Okay, well, thank you for that response. Actually, I'm keeping an eye out, by the way, in chat to see if anyone else is piping up. But in the meantime, just thinking about the more general effect of COVID that has happened and is ongoing. I guess there are probably some either sort of career stages that have been most affected, including people like parents of smaller children, early career researchers, and also specific activities within research as well, like perhaps collaborating. Like, how do you find new people to work with if everyone's sitting on a screen and it's all truncated. Do you want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, well, thankfully we have Zoom, as we know, and that meant that the effect on collaboration wasn't as dire as we thought it was. Teams could still communicate, but the restriction on travel meant that even if somebody was able to enter the country, they weren't able to have access to research facilities in order to produce research. And if you think of a research cycle, it's usually around 3 to 5 years, with the publication happening in the later parts of the cycle. If you had a grant that started in 2019, it was severely disrupted by the disruptions of the 2020-2022 period. And this meant that you will be delayed further on. What that means is that if you're delayed in disseminating research, this comes back to career implications as well on the individual, but also on the ability, everybody's scared of being scooped. So publishing something quickly rather than slowly is always within everyone's best interests. But if you're unable to do that, especially in a highly competitive field, that's where that becomes a problem. I also just want to say, I don't want to typecast anyone's COVID experience as bad or better or good or worse, because I think everybody had a bad pandemic. Everybody did. There was the disruptions that we had are in many cases so unique, or they're so intersectional that it's difficult to say, well, you belong in this group and therefore require only some mitigations, or you were obviously terribly disrupted, so you need more help. I don't think that kind of typology is existing. We all felt it. It was a global pandemic. It was globally felt. Sure, there were some very nice people who joined staff meetings from the sunny backyards, if they had backyards and no kids and all the rest of it. Sure, but I don't necessarily think that all disruptions are visible by, a kid in the back seat in the background pulling your hair. There's a reason why there's a necessity for blur your background on Zoom meetings. So I think that we need to have this discussion, because we can't assume that every parent was affected, and we can't assume that everyone on a precarious contract was affected. And these are the groups that are seen to be have a largely worse experience of pandemic, of balancing work, etc., and in need of further mitigation than others. I don't want to go into that conversation, because I think that this is a community discussion requiring a variety of different voices so that everybody feels represented. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, it's lots of nuance, isn't there? It's very difficult to generalize, which is part of what makes it so difficult to encompass, I think. Megan, you got your hand up. Do you want to unmute and come on camera?
Yeah. Megan McDevitt. I'm a managing editor, so work more in the editorial office space. But kind of just to go off of what Mary put in the chat about just that, overwhelming increase in submissions at the journal level, and then all the maneuvering to quickly move, completely change processes to fast track COVID related papers and all of that stuff. It still feels, in October 2023 that we're still in that kind of crisis mode. I hear from my colleagues that it's just an onslaught that has never stopped, and we haven't. And I think, I completely agree with a lot of things you said during your chat of we thought we were going to create a new something, but it doesn't. From what we're seeing, it's kind of, it didn't happen. We don't have time to even stop and consider and process how we could do things differently, because we just have this onslaught. Or it's finding trying to find reviewers and nobody has time, or even just volunteering level, nobody has time to join a committee or participate in this or that. So it's not really a question, just I guess it doesn't feel like where do we go from here? How do we, as a society, pause and reflect and move forward in a better way? Because at some point this is not sustainable to keep going like this.
I think what you're saying, Megan, is exactly a symptom of a fragile research ecosystem. It's the fact that every person is overworked and has no time to reflect, that we just keep going forward. But that's dangerous at the same time. We can't afford not to reflect on this. because it will happen again, and we don't want to be, further burdened with more work when the next one comes around, or don't have systems in order to facilitate that. So I think that, I understand. I think that this is a community responsibility to provide the spaces to talk, so we don't feel overburdened, that in fact, that we can get our voices across. And I think it's also as our community to basically say, the system is overburdened. It needs to stop. We need to stop, provide the spaces as well as listen to the voices to make sure that even if you don't have time to participate in this, that your views are somehow still incorporated, and that there are some policies, procedures, assistance in place, so the next time this happens, we don't get the effects. But I echo what you're saying. That's fine. I mean, I was an editor-in-chief at the time. We had a great big meeting via Zoom during the COVID pandemic, and we were talking about the influx of papers and how we were going to find reviewers to it. And one of the editors, who was advanced in age compared to me, at least, and very, very, very privileged in many of the different technical ways, said, I always find getting early career researchers to do reviews great. They're just so happy for the opportunity. And for me, I just literally banged my head against the wall and went, an early career researcher is not going to do it right now. But there was a lack of understanding from that person's perspective about how the system had changed and how it had differentially affected so groups, to the point when we were facing a crisis, they went back to old answers rather than by understanding how the pandemic had altered how people practice, especially in the early career category, and how that should alter perhaps the answers that we are presented with to solve a problem that we had in our journal. So yeah.
Muted.
Sorry.
Megan, did you have any follow-up on that?
No, you just completely echoed my experience, and that kind of, let's just go back to how it was, and instead of thinking, and I've had very similar kind of that hitting a wall of, we have tried that, but I guess we can try it again mindset. So at the very least,
there's no space to think broadly. There's just no
exactly. So I find things like these, EASE forums or other organization forums really helpful, because it at least makes me feel that I'm not the only one encountering these things. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Megan. Right, so we've got another question, person with a hand up, and then we've got some things in chat as well, which is good. So Janie, do you want to unmute and ask a question? Janie Zhao?
Hello. Hello, Dr. Derrick. I think the importance of peer review during the pandemic was revealed through the mass retraction of Hindawi journals. Think of 7,000 retractions and thousands of articles published through a manipulated publication process. This is the result of a lack of attention to peer review. The result of not taking peer review seriously. It happened during the pandemic, although I'm not sure if it is related to the pandemic. What else can we do to avoid this problem, other than strengthening peer review? What's your opinion?
I don't think the answer is strengthening peer review, because that implies making it more stringent, and being so stringent was probably what slowed it down. And the problem was during the pandemic is that they needed outcomes quickly, and peer review relied on peers to review it, and those peers were already under, as Megan said, as well as publishing houses, an incredibly amount of strain, didn't have the time to do it. I think preprints and open peer review have a very interesting role here. It's not something that was experimented upon during the pandemic rather than embedded into practice. I think that there's a lot of peer community ins that are coming in, or PCIs coming in, that would perhaps provide the platforms to allow for that to happen, that are worth exploring in partnership with existing journals to make sure that next time that this allows it to happen. But the other thing is that even though we're all under stress, to rely on a peer review system that relies on the goodwill of reviewers is one thing, but to continue to rely on it through goodwill when these people are already overburdened in the first place has moral and ethical implications as well. So I think that peer review, as it is done normally, is going to have to admit that when the push comes to shove, your peer reviewers are going to choose not to peer review. And during the COVID pandemic, push came to shove. So I think that new ways of encouraging the right type of peer reviewers to engage is needed. That might be something like allowing more time for peer review, but that goes against the whole idea of being able to get results out quickly and implemented quickly to societal benefit. I don't know what the answer is, but I know that I have every faith that answer can appear if we talk about it, but no one's talking about it. Peer review is this thing we can either have or haven't got. It's not something that we can alter. If we think about the peer review as a purpose, maybe it's accept decline in crimes. Maybe in times of crisis, there can be a pre-peer review process that can give it some sort of tick before it can go into the full peer review process. But I think we need to, I think what my results are showing is that there is a reluctance to challenge these systems towards new normal because, maybe because, as Megan said, we're all exhausted, but we need to really think about what we can replace, what is the purpose of peer review? How can we maintain the good things about peer review and get rid of the bad things of peer review in a time of crisis when we need, when the process of peer review and the requirements of society seem to contradict each other, or be in conflict. I don't know what the answer is, but if we talk about it, I'm sure that smart people will come up with someone, and we're all experts in this as well. So yeah.
Okay.
Jean-Yu, do you have any follow-up on that?
No, thank you for sharing your thoughts.
Yeah, it is a lot to think about, I think, and encompass that. Yeah, it's quite a wicked problem, I guess.
I think we're so used to thinking in with the walls around us are permanent, but what if they weren't? What if we could change them? What if we could not knock them down? But what if we could knock them down and build them back better? What would they look like? And that kind of broad, wicked thinking, as you say, Fiona, is something that we need to do. We've had this experience. It's a unique experience. We need to capitalize on that experience to build back something that can be more resilient in the future. If we don't, then if we don't remember our history, we're doomed to repeat it, right? Is that the saying?
I think it's something like that. But yeah, and somebody else sharing their experience actually in chat. It's Stefania saying, together with many papers received, the main problem is the editors to find reviewers. It really seems that time became precious, but the wish to publish was higher than to give the opinion on the science. So it's that balancing thing, and I suppose it's this set of decisions. As you've only got so much time, so you want to put your own ideas out there rather than review other people's.
And I get assessed on my own ideas, so my priority has to be publications. I don't get assessed for participating in peer review. I just don't, and most of the systems don't do it. There's, Publons might do it, but no one has time to participate as well during a period of crisis. So you've got to think about where the priorities of reviewers are. Unfortunately, they weren't with publications at that point in time because they had other things to do. But I think, realizing the choice architecture that researchers had to engage at particular points of crisis is a really important first step.
And Mary's been putting a few comments in chat. We might try and put them out as sort of part of the response to this later, Gemma. But she was saying that one of our Brazilian members was saying they've added a new question to their national CV, where researchers can say if they have family commitments, and so they can get they can, if you like, be flagged for additional support. And I guess that's a response, isn't it? It's that balancing between something that's like a blanket response to everyone that's in a particular category versus if we're going to be more nuanced, how long is that going to take? And will you kind of, if you like, lose resource through taking
How
up
is it
resource and trying to work it out?
taken into consideration at all? The other thing that I said is around that everybody had a pandemic. Why just parents? I mean,
Yeah, there are pets.
elderly
Yes.
parents. I mean, people with disabilities. You know, it becomes quite nuanced. So I think there's danger in isolating someone's experiences worse than another person's.
Yeah, I guess if it's a thing that's happening there at a national level, it's also then something that could be then assessed for whether there was effectiveness or not.
I mean, I know we have an international audience here, but here in the UK, we have this thing called the Research Excellence Framework. Not going to go into it now, but every like 8 years, it audits all of the research done within publicly funded organizations, which is the majority of them here in the UK, to award research funding. Okay. One of the big things that they're doing in the next REF, which is in 2028, the REF was supposed to be in 2020, but it got put back for obvious reasons to 2021. But the next one's in 2028. And what they're specifically looking at is they've specifically got this question in the environment statement, which will be 25% of the overall score for an institution, is about COVID and resilience and recovery from COVID. And that's partly because of the conversation that we've been having about how essential it is to talk about it going forward, but also too because evaluation can be a carrot as well as a stick. Try to get them to put in place processes to enable this constant reflection and learning from the experience of COVID forward towards, you know, building a more resilient research culture within organizations. So that is a big thing. But even in that, they don't specify what individuals had what experiences. It's quite broad. And I'm really interested to see what's going to happen between now and when that statement comes out in 2028, the end of 2028, 29, because I think that we'll get a better idea about how research has changed. At the moment, we've got broad scale population level stats, or we've got lived experiences, and the organizations things through research like this is in between. But I think that we'll get a very good idea then. But then it will be 2028, and maybe there's another one between now and then. You never know. Touch wood, because no one wants to do that again.
That's a cheerful thought. But there's another question that's actually come up in chat from Kristen. Any thoughts on paying reviewers as a way of evening up the...
You should have been doing that anyway. I think that there's two things that publishers can do. We can actually advocate for some systematic way of acknowledging it, acknowledging reviews, so that you put it on the same level as publishing in terms of career priorities for researchers, so that participating. The other way of doing it is paying them, sure, because we're not paid to do it in our time, in our contracts at the moment. So we are doing it above our contracts. So if you expect all researchers to do it, then you're seeing a chronically overworked workforce, just by the way that the reward system works or doesn't work within research. But the other thing is that provide incentives towards publication for your journals. So we're talking article processing fees, or ability to translate, my peer review, because, my organization might have diamond open access, for example, and I'm very privileged in that situation. But if I do 5 reviews, 4 reviews, I don't know how many number, then that labor can be translated to paying the article processing fees of somebody who, from an organization that isn't able to for a reason. That can be paid forward into the community rather than paid back to the individual reviewer. Again, break down those walls that are complaining our thinking. I like that equity. That's a good idea, Kristen. We should do that. Researchers aren't particularly good at paying it forward. I think we've got to get better at that as a community too.
I guess in some ways, maybe part of it's about articulation and value of some of the things that feel like administrative burden almost. And therefore they're not valorized as skilled research work. Yeah,
they're not. Well, my contract is with my organization, and so they, say this is what you've got to do. Peer review for a journal is not part of that. It's implied, but it's not explicitly done. Until it is, I can't get rewarded for it. Until I'm rewarded for it, I'm not going to prioritize it. And under a period of crisis, it's just,
It's is it the Maslow triangle? Since everybody went down, in a sense, went down from self-actualization and progressing their impact on the world down to enough to eat and somewhere to sleep. And
the other idea is to valorize the process more, so you're not acting as a blind peer reviewer. I mean, one of the good things I liked about reviewing much earlier was the fact that I got access to this research before anyone saw it. And that was amazing. And being able to interact with the author, although they didn't know who I was, but who they, was a privilege and really helped my own development as well, my own thinking, because and to get that early is good. Perhaps we should start thinking about opening up peer review and allowing it to be a dialogue between the reviewer and the reviewee. I think, Fiona, in our discussion, we talked about the concept that, has anyone heard of Adopt a Paper? It's a initiative set up by a group of economists that was basically peeling up people who were writing papers with potential mentors. And it would otherwise, if that didn't happen, that relationship would only occur through the blindness of peer review. But now it's being brought out to the open. Point being, it's about helping somebody produce a better paper, produce better science as a dialogue, not necessarily just through peer review, where it's, does this paper get minor, major restrictions, and should it get published? Yes or no. So it's something a little bit more, again, that challenges the idea of peer review. It's not just about assessment, it's about dialogue and improvement and feedback, which is something that my research has highlighted in the past. But that would increase the value of a peer reviewer to engage in the situation, because it's a privilege, and it's more of a privilege rather than, as you said, Fiona, an administrative burden.
Yeah, that's a good. I'm glad you brought that up. Actually, I think that's a very, very relevant initiative for this audience. I'll put the link actually into chat for Adopt a Paper. So that's hopefully the right one.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm just got an eye on the clock actually, and I think probably people are going to have to start, going on to their next meeting. So if there's anything final to
Can I just
bring up?
reply to Kristen where she says that if there's some say that if a grant has it, you're paid to peer review. No, no, it's not in my contract. It's not there. If I have a grant, which is a minority of the research population too, so you're only narrowing your collection of reviewers that way, then it's not part of my responsibilities to do it. My responsibility is to do the research, not to do the peer review of other people's. Point being that I think that if we try to find contractual reasoning for researchers to engage in peer reviews in the current model, I don't think that they're ever going to prioritize it. I think that you need to tell them to value it differently, and then they will.
Yeah, there's a lot of change needed, isn't there? I guess hopefully we've pushed it a bit in the right direction with this event. I hope so. But in any case, Gemma, thank you ever so much for putting this in front of us today and letting us hear it and interact with what you've been working on. I've really, really enjoyed it. I think everybody else has as well. Thank you everyone who's come and provided thoughtful comments and so forth as well. And I hope if you've got any further reflections or anything, you get in touch with Ease or with Gemma after the event. But other than that, this will go up on the Ease website for later on. And we're really, really pleased. If you've got any ideas for further ideas for webinars, let us know. And Gemma, let you get on with the rest of your day and your week.
No, thanks, guys. It's been a pleasure talking to you all. And good morning to those ones, good night for those ones as well, and good afternoon to those as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.